The trail of blood told the story that Jackson Wade wasn't ready to share. Dying beneath the scorching Texas sun wasn't how he'd planned to leave this world, but the 3 bullet wounds in his side suggested otherwise. His horse had somehow carried his half-conscious body to the outskirts of Fort Worth, before collapsing from exhaustion, leaving him to drag himself the remaining distance to the nearest saloon. The Lone Star, June 1875, wasn't being kind to Jackson. At 32 years old, he'd spent more than half his life on horseback, riding with the Texas Rangers until a month ago. Now he found himself hunched over a bottle of whiskey in the corner of the saloon, pressing a filthy bandana against the seeping wounds in his side, waiting for the courage to either find a doctor or simply bleed out in peace. Josephine Williams stepped into the Lone Star just as the afternoon heat reached its peak. At 26, she was no stranger to the rough edges of frontier life. Her cotton dress clung to her skin in the oppressive heat, and she paused at the entrance, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim interior. She'd come to find her brother Thomas, but instead, her gaze landed on the slumped figure in the corner, blood pooling on the floor beneath his chair. "Sir." Josephine approached cautiously, noting the empty tables surrounding him. The few other patrons had given him wide berth. "Sir, you need a doctor." Jackson's bloodshot eyes lifted slowly, focusing on her through the haze of pain and whiskey. "What I need is to be left alone, madam." "You're bleeding all over the floor," she pointed out, her voice matter of fact, "and from the looks of it, you've lost too much already." A bitter laugh escaped his cracked lips. "Nothing worth saving, I assure you." Josephine's eyes narrowed as she studied him, the worn ranger's badge partially visible beneath his blood-soaked coat, the calloused hands that spoke of years in the saddle, and eyes that had seen too much. She'd encountered his kind before, men who'd reached the end of their rope and were just waiting for the fall. "Stand up," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Madam, I appreciate the concern, but stand up," she repeated, louder this time. "Or I'll have every man in this saloon help me carry you out." Something in her voice, perhaps the unwavering determination, made Jackson attempt to rise. He managed to get halfway before his legs buckled. Josephine was at his side instantly, her shoulder under his arm, taking his weight. "Thomas." She called out, spotting her brother at the bar. "Help me with him." Thomas Williams, a broad-shouldered man with the same determined eyes as his sister, was there in an instant. "Joe, what are you doing?" "Saving a life," she said simply. "Help me get him to Doc Perkins." Between the two of them, they half-carried, half-dragged Jackson out into the blinding sunlight. The trail of blood following them drew curious stares from passers-by. "I don't need saving," Jackson muttered, his words slurring. "Let me be. Be quiet," Josephine said firmly. "You can die tomorrow if you're still set on it, but not today." The walk to Doc Perkins' office seemed endless. Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the woman's strong grip keeping him upright. Her voice was a constant in his ear, firm and unwavering. "Stay awake," she commanded, one foot in front of the other. "We're almost there." By the time they reached the doctor's small office on the edge of town, Jackson's shirt was soaked through with fresh blood. Doc Perkins, a gray-haired man with spectacles perched on his nose, took one look at Jackson and cleared his examination table with a sweep of his arm. 3 bullet wounds, Josephine explained as they laid Jackson down. "He's lost a lot of blood." "I can see that," Doc Perkins said grimly. "How long ago?" "Don't know," Jackson mumbled. "Day, maybe 2. The doctor's eyebrows shot up. "And you're still breathing. You're either the luckiest man in Texas or the stubbornest." "Probably both," Thomas said, stepping back from the table. "Joe, we should let the doc work." Josephine hesitated, her eyes fixed on Jackson's pale face. "I'll stay." "You most certainly will not," Doc Perkins said, already cutting away Jackson's shirt. "This isn't going to be pretty. Thomas, take your sister outside." Thomas placed a gentle hand on Josephine's arm. "Come on, Joe. We've done our part." She allowed herself to be led outside but paused at the door. "What's your name?" she asked Jackson. Through the fog of pain, he managed to focus on her face, the determined set of her jaw, the intensity in her eyes. "Jackson," he whispered. "Jackson Wade." "Well, Mr. Wade," she said firmly, "I expect to find you alive when I return tomorrow." As the door closed behind her, Jackson lost consciousness to the sound of Doc Perkins preparing his instruments and the lingering image of Josephine Williams' resolute face. The extraction of the bullets was a torturous affair that Jackson only half remembered. Doc Perkins had given him whiskey and laudanum, but nothing could fully dull the pain of probing metal instruments in open wounds. By nightfall, he lay on the doctor's cot, sewn up but burning with fever. "Infection set in," Doc Perkins told Josephine when she returned the next morning. "I've done what I can, but he needs care. Constant care." Josephine stood in the doorway of the small recovery room, watching Jackson's chest rise and fall with labored breaths. "Will he live?" "If the fever breaks, yes. If not." The doctor shrugged. "What happens to him if he recovers?" "That depends on who put those bullets in him," Doc Perkins said, lowering his voice. "Found a Texas Ranger badge in his pocket, former by the looks of it. The engraving's been scratched out." Josephine's brow furrowed. "He's running from something, or someone," the doctor agreed. "Either way, he can't stay here long. I need the space, and he'll need somewhere to recover properly once he's stable." Josephine's decision came quickly, formed with the same determination that had driven her to help Jackson in the first place. "I'll take him." "Joe, you can't be serious," Thomas protested, having just entered the room. "We know nothing about this man. We know he needs help," she replied simply. "And we have the space at the ranch." Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "What would Father say?" "Father would help a man in need," Josephine said firmly. "You know he would." Their father, Harold Williams, had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving the small cattle ranch to his children. With Thomas handling most of the ranch work and Josephine managing the house and finances, they'd managed to keep the operation running. He could be an outlaw, Thomas argued. "He was a ranger," Josephine countered, "and whatever he is now, he deserves a chance to live." Thomas knew that look in his sister's eyes, the same stubborn determination their father had possessed. "Fine," he conceded, "but if he causes any trouble, he's gone." For 3 days, Jackson hovered between life and death, his fever raging. Josephine moved a cot into the doctor's recovery room, refusing to leave his side. She bathed his forehead with cool water, changed his bandages, and spoke to him constantly, though he rarely showed signs of hearing her. "You don't get to die," she told him firmly on the 3rd night, as his fever reached its peak. "Not after all this trouble I've gone to." Whether it was her words, her care, or simple luck, Jackson's fever broke in the early hours of the 4th day. Doc Perkins found Josephine asleep in her chair, her hand still holding a damp cloth to Jackson's forehead. "Miss Williams," the doctor said gently, waking her. "His fever's broken." Josephine blinked awake, immediately reaching for Jackson's forehead. The skin was cool and damp beneath her touch. "He's going to live. Looks that way," Doc Perkins confirmed, "though he's still got a long recovery ahead." Jackson's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Josephine with confusion. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I told you I would be," she replied. A week later, against Doc Perkins' advice but with Josephine's insistence, Jackson was moved to the Williams Ranch. The journey in the back of Thomas's wagon was painful, every bump in the road sending spikes of agony through his healing wounds. But Jackson endured in silence, watching the landscape roll by and wondering how he'd ended up in the care of this fiercely determined woman. The Williams Ranch sat 10 miles outside Fort Worth, a modest spread with a sturdy main house, a bunkhouse for the few ranch hands they employed, and grazing land that stretched toward the horizon. Jackson was installed in a small room off the kitchen that had once belonged to a ranch hand who'd moved on to California. "It's not much," Josephine said, as Thomas helped Jackson onto the narrow bed, "but it's clean and close enough that I can hear if you need anything." Jackson looked around the simple room: a bed, a small table, a chair, and a window overlooking the corral. "It's more than I deserve." Josephine's expression hardened slightly. "I didn't save your life so you could wallow in self-pity, Mr. Wade." Her directness startled a laugh from him, which immediately turned into a grimace of pain. "Yes, madam. Good. Rest now. Dinner's at 6. As she turned to leave, Jackson caught her wrist lightly. "Why are you doing this?" Josephine paused, looking down at his hand on hers, then into his eyes. "Because everyone deserves a tomorrow, Mr. Wade, even those who think they don't." For the first 2 weeks at the Williams Ranch, Jackson slept more than he was awake. His body, pushed beyond its limits, demanded rest to heal. When he was conscious, he was aware of Josephine's presence, bringing food, changing bandages, opening the window to let in fresh air, reading aloud from a book as he drifted in and out of sleep. By the 3rd week, he was strong enough to sit in the chair by the window for short periods, watching the daily activities of the ranch. He observed Thomas directing the ranch hands, noticed the respect they showed Josephine when she crossed the yard, and gradually pieced together the story of the Williams siblings from snippets of conversation and his own observations. "Your father built this place?" Jackson asked one evening as Josephine changed his bandages. "Started it," she corrected. "Thomas and I have added to it over the years. It was just a small cabin and a few head of cattle when father first claimed the land 20 years ago. You've done well with it." Her hands paused in their work. "We manage. Though cattle prices have been falling and the railroads changed everything, small ranchers like us are feeling the squeeze." Jackson nodded. The expansion of the railroads had transformed the cattle industry, bringing both opportunity and hardship. "Thomas seems to know what he's doing." "He does," Josephine agreed, resuming her task. "But he can't be everywhere at once, and good help is hard to find." She secured the fresh bandage and sat back. "There, how does that feel?" "Better." Jackson hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering him. "Don't you want to know?" "Know what?" "Why I was shot, who I am, what I've done." Josephine gathered the used bandages, her expression carefully neutral. "When you're ready to tell me, I'll listen. Until then, it's not my business." As she turned to leave, Jackson spoke again, the words tumbling out before he could reconsider. "I was a ranger for 14 years, joined when I was 18, fresh off my father's farm and looking for adventure." Josephine paused at the door but didn't turn. "I was good at it," Jackson continued. "Too good, maybe. Did things I'm not proud of, all in the name of the law." He stared out the window, seeing not the ranch but the ghosts of his past. "Last month, my captain ordered us to raid a settlement of Mexican families near the border. Said they were harboring bandits." Josephine turned now, watching his face. "There weren't any bandits," Jackson said quietly. "Just families, farmers, children, but the orders came anyway. Clear them out," he said. The land they were on suddenly had value to someone important in Austin. "What did you do?" Josephine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I refused, told the captain I wouldn't be part of it." Jackson's laugh was hollow. "He didn't take kindly to that, said I was either with them or against them. I chose against." He touched his side where the bullet wounds were healing. "3 of my former brothers in arms caught up with me outside El Paso. I managed to get away, but not before they left their mark." Josephine was silent for a long moment. "Are they still looking for you?" "Probably," Jackson admitted. "Men like Captain Daniels Reynolds don't forget disobedience." "Why tell me this now?" Jackson met her eyes directly. "Because you deserve to know what kind of trouble I might bring to your door, and because—" He swallowed hard. "Because if I'm going to die here, I wanted someone to know the truth of it." Josephine straightened, her jaw set in that now familiar determined line. "You're not going to die here, Mr. Wade, and as for the trouble, we're no strangers to that." As April turned to May, Jackson's strength returned gradually. He began taking short walks around the house, then venturing into the yard, and finally, by mid-May, joining Thomas and the ranch hands for simple tasks that didn't strain his healing wounds. "You know cattle," Thomas observed one afternoon as they mended a broken section of corral fence together. Jackson nodded, hammering a nail with practiced ease. Grew up on a farm in East Texas. Pa raised a few head along with the crops. Thomas studied him for a moment. We could use an extra hand around here, someone who knows what they're doing. The offer caught Jackson by surprise. Your sister might have something to say about that. A smile tugged at Thomas's mouth. It was her idea. That evening, as Josephine served dinner, Jackson broached the subject. Your brother says you suggested I stay on as a ranch hand. Josephine set down a plate of beef stew in front of him. I did. Why? She took her seat across from him, Thomas, at the head of the table. Because you need work, we need help, and you're already here. It's not charity, Thomas added, breaking off a piece of bread. You'd earn your keep same as anyone else. Jackson looked between the siblings, these people who'd saved his life and now offered him a future. I'm still healing. You're strong enough for light work, Josephine pointed out. And getting stronger every day. And there's the matter of the men who are after me, Jackson reminded them. I won't bring danger to your home. Josephine's expression didn't waver. Fort Worth isn't El Paso. And if your former colleagues do come looking, they'll find more than they bargained for. Thomas nodded in agreement. The Williams family doesn't scare easily, Wade. Never have. Jackson considered their offer, weighing his options. The truth was, he had nowhere else to go, no plan beyond survival. And something about this place, about these people, especially the determined woman across the table, made him want to stay. All right, he said finally. I'll stay on, until you decide you don't want me around anymore. Good, Josephine said, as if the matter had been settled from the start. You can move to the bunkhouse once Doc Perkins gives you a clean bill of health. As spring gave way to summer, Jackson settled into life at the Williams Ranch. His wounds healed completely, leaving only scars as reminders of his brush with death. He moved into the bunkhouse with the other 3 ranch hands: Bill Carpenter, a grizzled veteran of the cattle drives, Miguel Sanchez, a skilled horseman from south of the border, and Ezra Johnson, a young man barely out of his teens learning the trade. Jackson found purpose in the daily routine of ranch life, mending fences, tending cattle, breaking horses. The hard physical labor was a welcome distraction from the memories that still haunted his dreams. And if he sometimes positioned himself where he could keep an eye on Josephine as she went about her tasks, he told himself it was merely out of a sense of protectiveness toward the woman who had saved his life. Josephine, for her part, watched Jackson's transformation from half-dead stranger to capable ranch hand with quiet satisfaction. She noticed the way the haunted look in his eyes gradually faded, how his shoulders straightened, how his rare smiles became more frequent. She told herself her interest was nothing more than concern for his recovery, but she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest when their eyes met across the corral or at the dinner table. One scorching July afternoon, Jackson was returning from the north pasture when he spotted an unfamiliar rider approaching the main house. Something about the man's posture, the military straightness of his back, the purposeful way he handled his horse, set alarm bells ringing in Jackson's mind. He redirected his own mount, circling around to approach the house from the side, keeping out of sight. The stranger dismounted at the hitching post and knocked on the front door. Jackson, now close enough to see clearly, felt his blood run cold. Detective Harmon Mitchell from the Texas Rangers, one of Captain Reynolds' most loyal men. Josephine answered the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Jackson was too far away to hear their conversation, but he saw Mitchell remove his hat, saw him show Josephine something likely his badge. Saw her shake her head in what appeared to be confusion. Mitchell spoke for several minutes, Josephine's posture becoming increasingly rigid. Finally, she shook her head firmly and began to close the door. Mitchell's hand shot out, stopping it. Even from a distance, Jackson could see the change in his demeanor, the shift from official politeness to threatening. Without conscious thought, Jackson urged his horse forward, emerging from his hiding place and approaching the house at a canter. Mitchell turned at the sound, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Afternoon," Jackson called, keeping his voice casual despite the thundering of his heart. He tipped his hat to Josephine. "Everything all right, Miss Williams?" Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he studied Jackson, recognition dawning slowly. "Wade, Jackson Wade," Jackson dismounted, positioning himself between Mitchell and Josephine. "Detective Mitchell, it's been a while." "Not long enough," Mitchell growled. "Captain Reynolds has been looking for you." "I'm sure he has," Jackson said evenly. "But whatever business you have with the captain, it doesn't concern Miss Williams or her ranch." Mitchell's hand still hovered near his gun. "It concerns her when she's harboring a deserter and a traitor." Josephine stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Mr. Wade works for me, detective. He's committed no crime that I'm aware of. Interfering with a ranger operation is crime enough," Mitchell spat. "He disobeyed direct orders, attacked fellow rangers, and fled justice." "Is that what Reynolds is calling it these days? Justice?" Jackson's voice hardened. "Tell me, Mitchell, did you participate in the raid on those families? Did you help clear them out so some rich man in Austin could have their land?" A flicker of something shame perhaps crossed Mitchell's face before his expression hardened again. "I follow orders, Wade, something you forgot how to do." "Some orders deserve to be forgotten," Jackson replied quietly. The tension between the two men was palpable, a hair trigger away from violence. Josephine moved deliberately between them, facing Mitchell. "Detective Mitchell," she said firmly, "I understand you have a job to do, but this is my property and I'm asking you to leave." Mitchell's eyes darted between Josephine and Jackson. "This isn't over, Wade. The captain won't stop looking." "Then he knows where to find me," Jackson replied. With a final glare, Mitchell mounted his horse and rode away, dust billowing in his wake. Jackson watched until he disappeared from sight, then turned to Josephine. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never meant to bring this to your door." Josephine studied his face, her expression unreadable. "Did you mean what you said, about the families?" "Every word," Jackson confirmed. "Reynolds wanted that land cleared for a political supporter. When I refused to be part of it, he made sure I paid the price." Josephine nodded slowly. "Then you have nothing to apologize for." She turned back toward the house, then paused. "Will he be back, Mitchell?" "Yes," Jackson said honestly, "or others like him. Then we'll be ready." That night, Jackson couldn't sleep. The encounter with Mitchell had brought his past roaring back, reminding him that his peaceful existence at the Williams Ranch was temporary at best. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring into the darkness, when a soft knock came at the bunkhouse door. The other men were asleep or pretending to be. Jackson rose quietly and opened the door to find Josephine standing there, a lantern in her hand. "Miss Williams?" "I need to speak with you," she said quietly. "Privately." Jackson nodded, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. They walked in silence to the corral fence, far enough from both the bunkhouse and the main house to ensure privacy. "You should leave," Josephine said without preamble. The words hit Jackson like a physical blow, though he'd been expecting them since Mitchell's visit. "I understand." "No, you don't," Josephine said, frustration evident in her voice. "I'm not asking you to leave because I want you gone. I'm saying you should leave because it's not safe for you here." Jackson studied her face in the lantern light, the worry evident in her eyes. "Mitchell finding me here puts you and Thomas in danger." "I'm not concerned about us," she insisted. "We can handle ourselves." "Then why? Because I can't bear the thought of them taking you," Josephine burst out, the words seemingly surprising her as much as they did Jackson. She looked away, composing herself. "What you did was right, standing against injustice, refusing orders that went against your conscience. I don't want to see you punished for that." Jackson reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing her arm. "Josephine." It was the first time he'd used her given name. Her eyes met his and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that had been building since that first day in the saloon. "I won't run," Jackson said firmly. "Not anymore. And I won't leave you and Thomas to face whatever comes because of me." "It's my choice to make," Josephine argued, "my risk to take." And it's my stand to make, Jackson countered. Here with people worth standing for. Josephine's expression softened. She stepped closer, close enough that Jackson could feel the warmth of her presence in the cool night air. You're a stubborn man, Jackson Wade. I learned from the best, he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Then Josephine raised her hand, hesitantly touching his cheek. Promise me you'll be careful. Jackson covered her hand with his own. I promise. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Then Josephine stepped back, breaking the spell. Good night, Mr. Wade. Good night, Miss Williams. As she walked back toward the house, lantern light guiding her way, Jackson knew with absolute certainty that he would die before he let harm come to her, or this place that had become his sanctuary. The weeks following Mitchell's visit passed in tense anticipation, but no rangers appeared on the horizon. Life at the ranch continued. Cattle were tended, crops were harvested, repairs were made. Yet beneath the surface of normalcy ran an undercurrent of watchfulness. Jackson never rode out without his rifle, and Thomas arranged for one of the hands to be near the house at all times. Despite, or perhaps because of the lingering threat, something shifted between Jackson and Josephine. Their conversations grew longer, their glances held more meaning, and they found themselves seeking out each other's company in quiet moments. You never talk about your life before, Jackson said one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, Thomas having gone to town for supplies. Before the ranch, I mean. Josephine's hands stilled in her lap. There's not much to tell. Mother died when I was 12. Father raised us here, taught us everything he knew about ranching and life. No suitors. A woman like you must have had plenty of interested parties. A small smile curved her lips. A few, none worth mentioning. And now, Jackson asked, his voice dropping slightly. Josephine turned to face him, her expression open yet guarded. Now I have a ranch to run, a brother to look after, and a former Texas Ranger with a price on his head living in my bunkhouse. Suitors are the least of my concerns. Jackson laughed softly. When you put it that way, I can see the appeal of spinsterhood. I didn't say that, Josephine replied, her eyes meeting his. Just that my priorities have changed. The air between them hummed with possibility, but before either could speak further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Thomas was returning, and he wasn't alone. Riders coming in, Jackson said, standing and reaching instinctively for the rifle that was never far from his side. Josephine stood as well, squinting into the gathering darkness. It's Thomas, she confirmed, then frowned. And Sheriff Davis, and... Her voice trailed off as she recognized the third rider. Mitchell, Jackson said grimly, recognizing the ranger detective's straight-backed posture even in the dim light. Josephine's hand found his arm. Jackson. It's all right, he assured her, though his heart hammered in his chest. Let's hear what they have to say. The three riders pulled up to the hitching post. Thomas dismounted first, his expression a mix of concern and resignation. Joe, Jackson, Sheriff Davis, and Detective Mitchell want to talk. Sheriff Davis, a stout man with a graying mustache and the perpetually weary expression of someone who'd seen too much of human nature, nodded respectfully. Miss Williams, Mr. Wade. Mitchell remained mounted, his hand resting near his holstered pistol. Wade, I'm here to bring you in. Captain Reynolds wants you to stand trial for desertion and interference with a ranger operation. Jackson stepped forward, keeping Josephine behind him. On what authority? I left the Rangers. I'm a private citizen now. You know it doesn't work that way, Mitchell replied. Once a ranger, always a ranger. The captain says you're subject to ranger justice. Sheriff Davis cleared his throat. Now hold on, Mitchell. We agreed you'd present the charges properly. This is Fort Worth jurisdiction, not ranger territory. Mitchell's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. Wade is accused of disobeying direct orders, assaulting fellow rangers, and abandoning his post during an official operation. And what operation was that? Josephine asked sharply. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. Ranger business, madam. The forcible removal of Mexican families from their legal homesteads, Jackson stated flatly, on behalf of a land speculator with political connections. Sheriff Davis's bushy eyebrows rose. That true, Mitchell? Our orders were to clear bandits from the border region, Mitchell replied stiffly. Wade refused to participate and attacked 2 rangers who tried to detain him. After they opened fire on me, Jackson added, 3 bullets in my side from men I'd ridden with for years. An uncomfortable silence fell. Sheriff Davis looked between Jackson and Mitchell, clearly weighing the situation. Here's what's going to happen, the sheriff finally said. Mr. Wade, I'm asking you to come into town tomorrow morning and give a formal statement about these events. Detective Mitchell will present the Rangers' side. I'll hear you both out and make a determination about how to proceed. And if I refuse, Jackson asked, don't make this harder than it needs to be, son, Davis said wearily. I'm trying to handle this by the book. Thomas stepped forward. Jackson will be there, Sheriff. You have my word, Mitchell scoffed. Your word doesn't carry much weight, Williams, when you've been harboring him all this time. That's enough, Mitchell, Sheriff Davis said firmly. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, my office. He tipped his hat to Josephine. Miss Williams, I apologize for the disturbance. As the sheriff and Mitchell rode away, Thomas turned to Jackson and Josephine. I ran into them in town. Mitchell was organizing a posse to come out here and take you by force. I convinced Davis to intervene. Thank you, Jackson said, clasping Thomas's shoulder. Don't thank me yet, Thomas replied grimly. Mitchell won't give up easily, and he's got the Rangers behind him. Not all of them, Jackson said. There are good men in the Rangers' men who wouldn't stand for what Reynolds ordered. Then you need to find them, Josephine said suddenly. Before tomorrow. Both men turned to her in surprise. What do you mean? Thomas asked. Jackson needs witnesses, Josephine explained, her mind working quickly. Other Rangers who knew about the orders who can confirm his story. Jackson shook his head. The ones who would speak up are scattered across Texas. There's no time. There must be someone in Fort Worth, Josephine insisted. Someone who knows the truth. Jackson frowned, thinking, Daniels Reynolds has enemies even within the Rangers, and... His expression cleared suddenly. Douglas Reed, who? Thomas asked. A fellow Ranger, retired now, lives just outside Fort Worth. He served with Reynolds for 20 years, knew all his dirty business. Jackson's eyes lit with renewed hope. If anyone would speak against Reynolds, it's Reed. Can you find him by morning? Josephine asked. Jackson nodded. I can try, then go, she urged. Now tonight, Thomas looked between them, concerned. If you don't show up tomorrow, Davis will have no choice but to issue a warrant. I'll be there, Jackson promised, with or without Reed. The decision made, Jackson quickly prepared to ride out. As he saddled his horse, Josephine appeared at his side, a bundle in her hands. Food, she explained, securing it to his saddle, and a clean shirt for tomorrow. She hesitated, then added softly, Be careful, Jackson. He turned to her, suddenly aware that this might be their last moment alone. If things went poorly tomorrow, he could be in custody or worse. Josephine, he began, the words he wanted to say catching in his throat. She seemed to understand. Standing on tiptoe, she pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. Come back to me, she whispered. Whatever happens tomorrow, come back. Jackson caught her hand, holding it against his heart. I will, he promised. That's one order I won't disobey. With that, he mounted his horse and rode into the night, carrying the warmth of her touch and the weight of her hope with him. The night was a blur of dusty trails and urgent conversations. Jackson found Douglas Reed's small homestead just before midnight, rousing the old Ranger from his bed with insistent knocking. Reed, a craggy-faced man with a limp from an old bullet wound, was initially suspicious, but recognized Jackson from joint operations years earlier. Wade. What in tarnation are you doing here at this hour? Jackson explained his situation quickly, laying out the details of Reynolds' orders, his refusal, and the consequences. Reed listened in silence, his weathered face revealing nothing. Reynolds always was a snake, Reed said finally. But he's a powerful snake with friends in high places. I need someone to corroborate my story, Jackson pressed. Someone who knows what kind of man Reynolds really is. Reed rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Coming forward against Reynolds could make life difficult for an old man like me. I understand, Jackson said, disappointment heavy in his chest. Reed studied him for a long moment. You really left over those Mexican families? I did. A slow smile spread across Reed's face. Well, I'll be damned. Looks like at least one ranger still remembers what that badge is supposed to stand for. He reached for his coat. Give me 10 minutes to get dressed and saddle my horse. We've got a long night ahead of us. Together, they rode not back to the Williams Ranch but into Fort Worth, seeking out other former rangers that Reed knew in the area. By dawn, they had gathered 3 more men willing to speak against Reynolds, each with their own stories of the captain's corruption and abuse of power. As the town began to stir, Jackson and his unlikely allies gathered at a small cafe near the sheriff's office, forming their plan for the coming confrontation. Reynolds won't take this lying down, warned Henry Blackburn, a former ranger who now ran the livery stable in Fort Worth. He'll come after all of us. Let him try, said George Hamilton, another ex-ranger. I'm too old to be scared of the likes of Daniels Reynolds. Reed nodded in agreement. Together, our word carries weight, especially with Davis. He's a fair man if a cautious one. At precisely 10 o'clock, Jackson walked into Sheriff Davis's office, flanked by Reed and the others. Mitchell was already there, his expression darkening at the sight of Jackson's companions. What is this? He demanded. Sheriff Davis looked equally surprised. Mr. Wade, I see you've brought friends. Witnesses, Sheriff, Jackson corrected. Men who can speak to Captain Reynolds' character and the nature of his orders. The next 2 hours were tense as each man gave his testimony. Reed spoke of Reynolds' long history of using ranger authority for personal gain. Blackburn and Hamilton provided specific instances of Reynolds targeting innocent families to clear land for political allies. And John Prescott, the 4th man Jackson had gathered, had actually been present when Reynolds gave the orders that Jackson refused. I was there, Prescott confirmed. Reynolds ordered us to clear those families out by force if necessary, said anyone who resisted was to be treated as a bandit. Wade was the only one with the guts to say no. Throughout the testimonies, Mitchell's face grew increasingly flushed with anger. These are lies, he insisted. Or the confused memories of old men. 4 old men with the same confused memories, Sheriff Davis asked skeptically. That's quite a coincidence, Detective. Mitchell stood abruptly. This is a ranger matter. We have jurisdiction. Not in my town you don't, Davis said firmly. Not when it comes to accusations of this nature. He turned to Jackson. Mr. Wade, based on what I've heard, I see no grounds to detain you or turn you over to the Rangers. As far as I'm concerned, you're a free man. Relief washed over Jackson, but it was short-lived. Mitchell's hand moved to his gun. This isn't over. The captain will hear about this. I'm counting on it, Jackson replied evenly. In fact, I think the governor might be interested in hearing about it too, and the newspapers. Mitchell's face paled slightly. You wouldn't dare. Try me, Jackson challenged. Reynolds wanted this kept quiet. How do you think he'll react when it becomes public knowledge? The threat hung in the air between them. Finally, Mitchell's hand dropped from his gun. You've made a powerful enemy today, Wade, all of you have. His gaze swept the room before returning to Jackson. Watch your back. With that, he stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Sheriff Davis sighed heavily. He's right about one thing. Reynolds won't let this go easily. Let him come, Reed said confidently. We've faced worse than Daniels Reynolds. As they left the sheriff's office, Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since refusing Reynolds' orders, he could breathe freely. The threat wasn't gone, but it was diminished, and he was no longer alone in facing it. Thank you, he told the men who had stood with him. I won't forget this. Reed clapped him on the shoulder. Just live a good life, son. That'll be thanks enough. Jackson rode back to the Williams Ranch with a lighter heart than he'd had in months. As he approached, he saw Josephine waiting on the porch, shading her eyes against the midday sun. He urged his horse to a canter, eager to share the news. Josephine met him at the hitching post, her face tight with worry. "What happened?" Jackson dismounted, grinning. "Sheriff Davis cleared me. I'm a free man." Relief flooded her features, and without hesitation, she threw her arms around him. "Thank God," she whispered against his chest. Jackson held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her against him. "I kept my promise," he murmured. "I came back." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her eyes shining. "And Mitchell?" "Not happy," Jackson admitted. "Reynolds won't give up entirely, but his hands are tied for now. Too many witnesses, too much risk of the story spreading." Thomas emerged from the barn, relief evident on his face when he saw Jackson. "Good news, I take it?" Jackson nodded, reluctantly releasing Josephine. "The best." That evening they celebrated with a special dinner. Josephine prepared Jackson's favorite meal, venison stew and fresh baked bread, and Thomas broke out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. As they sat around the table, the relief of the day's events gave way to a warm sense of belonging that Jackson hadn't felt in years. "A toast," Thomas said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings." "To standing your ground," Josephine added, her eyes meeting Jackson's across the table. Jackson raised his own glass. "To finding family when you least expect it." Later, as Thomas retired for the night, Jackson and Josephine lingered on the porch, reluctant to end the day. The summer night was warm, stars speckling the vast Texas sky above them. "What will you do now?" Josephine asked softly. "Now that you're truly free to choose." Jackson considered the question, looking out over the ranch that had become his home. "I think I'd like to stay," he said finally, "if you and Thomas are still offering that position." "The position is yours for as long as you want it," Josephine assured him. She hesitated, then added, "But is that really what you want, to be a ranch hand?" Jackson turned to face her, gathering his courage. "That depends," he said carefully, "on whether being a ranch hand is all I can hope to be here." Josephine's breath caught. "What else would you hope to be?" "More," Jackson said simply. "To you." The word hung between them, filled with possibility. Josephine stepped closer, close enough that Jackson could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "You already are more," she whispered. "You have been since the day I found you in that saloon." Jackson reached out, gently touching her cheek. "I was dying that day, not just from the bullets, but from inside. I had nothing to live for." His voice grew husky with emotion. "You gave me a reason to see tomorrow, Josephine. You gave me hope when I thought there was none left." "And you?" Josephine asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What have you given me?" "Everything I have," Jackson answered honestly. "Everything I am, and if you'll let me, I want to give you forever." The words were a promise, a pledge, a question all at once. Josephine's answer came not in words, but in the way she rose on tiptoe, her lips meeting his in a kiss that spoke of longing finally fulfilled, of paths converging, of home found at last. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Josephine Williams. I think I have since you ordered me not to die." She laughed softly, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "I love you too, Jackson Wade, even when you were the most stubborn patient I'd ever encountered." "I'll work on that," he promised with a smile. "Don't," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "I've grown rather fond of your stubborn streak." The following weeks passed in a blur of happiness for Jackson and Josephine. Though they kept their growing relationship relatively private, the knowing smiles from Thomas and the ranch hands suggested it wasn't much of a secret. Jackson moved from the bunkhouse into a small room in the main house, a compromise between propriety and the desire to be near each other. Their courtship was unconventional by the standards of Fort Worth society. Instead of formal dinners and chaperoned outings, they built their relationship in shared work and quiet moments riding the fence line together at dawn. Josephine teaching Jackson her mother's recipes, planning improvements to the ranch side by side. By late summer, Jackson had become as essential to the Williams ranch as if he'd been there all along. Under his guidance, they expanded their cattle operation, added 2 new hands, and improved the irrigation system for the small vegetable plot Josephine maintained. "You've transformed this place," Thomas remarked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the grazing land. "Pa would be impressed." "Josephine's the one with the vision," Jackson replied. "I'm just helping make it happen," Thomas chuckled. "You two are quite a pair." He hesitated, then added more seriously, "I've never seen my sister so happy, not since before Ma died." Jackson nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "She saved my life, Thomas, in more ways than one." "I know," Thomas said simply, "and that's why I want you to have this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch, handing it to Jackson. Inside, Jackson found a simple gold ring with a small pearl. "Thomas, it was our mother's," Thomas explained. "Pa always said it should go to the man who won Joe's heart. That's you, Jackson." Jackson stared at the ring, overcome with emotion. "I haven't asked her yet." "Then what are you waiting for?" Thomas challenged with a grin. "The way you two look at each other, I'm surprised you haven't already." The truth was, Jackson had been thinking about proposing for weeks. He'd even saved enough to buy a ring in Fort Worth. But something had held him back, a lingering fear that his past might still return to haunt them, that he might bring danger to Josephine's door. "Reynolds is still out there," Jackson said quietly, "and men like him don't forget." Thomas's expression grew serious. "Life doesn't give guarantees, Jackson. Pa used to say that happiness isn't about avoiding storms, it's about finding someone worth weathering them with." Jackson closed his fingers around the ring. "Your father was a wise man." "That he was," Thomas agreed. "And he'd be the first to tell you not to waste time worrying about what might happen when you could be living what is happening." The next day, Jackson rode into Fort Worth alone, returning with a small package that he carefully tucked into his saddlebag. That evening, he asked Josephine to ride with him to a spot he'd discovered on the property, a small rise overlooking a bend in the creek, where wildflowers grew in abundance, and the sunset painted the sky in spectacular colors. "It's beautiful," Josephine said as they dismounted, gazing out over the vista. "How did you find this place?" "I was tracking a stray heifer," Jackson explained, spreading a blanket on the ground. "Got lost in the view instead." They sat together, shoulders touching, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Jackson had rehearsed his words a dozen times, but now that the moment had arrived, he found himself speechless in the face of all he felt for her. "Jackson." Josephine prompted, sensing his uncharacteristic nervousness. "Is everything all right?" He took her hand in his, gathering his courage. "Josephine, when I rode into Fort Worth 3 months ago, I was a man without hope, without future, without purpose. I was just trying to stay alive long enough to die on my own terms." Her fingers tightened around his, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "Then you found me, stubborn and bleeding and convinced there was nothing left worth fighting for." Jackson's voice grew rough with emotion. "You didn't just save my life that day, you gave me a reason to live it." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing both his mother's ring from Thomas and the small package he'd purchased in town. "I can't offer you a perfect life. I can't promise there won't be challenges or that my past won't someday catch up to us." "I don't want perfect," Josephine said softly. "I just want you." Jackson opened the small package first, revealing a simple silver locket. "Open it," he urged. Josephine did, finding inside a tiny scrap of paper. She unfolded it carefully to reveal a single word written in Jackson's neat hand. "Tomorrow." "Every day since I met you," he explained, "you've given me a reason to see tomorrow. And now I want to give you all my tomorrows for as long as I have them." He opened the velvet pouch next, Thomas's mother's ring gleaming in the sunset light. "Josephine Williams, will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, she found her voice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Jackson Wade, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the setting sun cast them in golden light, a promise of all the sunsets they would share in the years to come. They were married in October 1875, when the Texas heat had finally broken and the land was touched with the first hints of autumn gold. The ceremony was small but joyful, held on the ranch with Sheriff Davis officiating. Douglas Reed and the other former Rangers who had stood by Jackson came to celebrate, along with neighbors from surrounding ranches and friends from Fort Worth. Thomas gave his sister away, pride and happiness evident in every line of his face. Josephine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered slightly by her own skilled hands, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. And Jackson, standing beneath an arch of timber and roses that he and Thomas had built, watched his bride approach with a sense of wonder that such happiness could be his. "I, Jackson Wade, take you, Josephine Williams, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to love you, honor you, and protect you in good times and bad, until death parts us. I, Josephine Williams, take you, Jackson Wade, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she replied, her eyes shining with joy. "I promise to love you, support you, and stand by your side in good times and bad, until death parts us." As Sheriff Davis pronounced them man and wife, Jackson drew Josephine into a kiss that sealed their promises and began their shared future. The gathered crowd erupted in cheers and applause, celebrating not just a marriage but a story of redemption and second chances. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, food and laughter. As the final guests departed, Thomas presented the newlyweds with his wedding gift, the deed to a parcel of land adjoining the main ranch house. "For your own home," he explained, "though you're welcome to stay in the main house until it's built." Jackson clasped his new brother-in-law in a fierce embrace. "Thank you doesn't seem enough. Just make her happy," Thomas replied simply. "That's all the thanks I need." In the months that followed, Jackson and Josephine settled into married life with a joy that made even the most mundane tasks seem special. Together with Thomas, they expanded the ranch operations, increasing their cattle herd and adding horses to their stock. The Williams-Wade Ranch, as it came to be known, developed a reputation for quality livestock and fair dealings. Jackson's past remained a shadow at the edges of their happiness. But as time passed with no sign of Captain Reynolds or his men, the shadow gradually faded. Douglas Reed and his fellow former Rangers kept their ears to the ground, sending occasional word that Reynolds was occupied with troubles of his own investigations into his conduct, questions from superiors, the very public scrutiny he had sought to avoid. By the spring of 1876, Jackson and Josephine had completed their own home, a sturdy four-room cabin near the main house, built by Jackson's hands with help from Thomas and the ranch hands. Though modest, it was filled with touches that made it uniquely theirs: bookshelves for Josephine's beloved books, a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, a kitchen designed around Josephine's preferences. It was in this home, on a rainy April morning, that Josephine shared news that would change their lives once more. "Jackson," she said, as they lingered over breakfast, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from his coffee, noting the mix of excitement and nervousness in her eyes. "What is it, love?" Josephine took his hand, guiding it to rest against her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a child." Joy unlike anything Jackson had ever known flooded through him. "A baby, you're sure?" She nodded, her smile radiant. "Doc Perkins confirmed it yesterday." "Come September, there will be 3 of us." Jackson pulled her into his arms, overcome with emotion. I never dared hope for such happiness." "Believe it," Josephine whispered, holding him tight. "This is our forever, Jackson, the one you promised me." The news of the coming child cemented what Jackson had already begun to feel, that his life before Josephine had been a prelude. Preparation for the real story that began the day she found him in that saloon. Every hardship he had endured, every difficult choice, had led him to her, to this ranch, to this moment of perfect joy. Summer passed in a haze of anticipation. Jackson threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival. adding a nursery to their home, crafting a cradle from oak harvested on their land, hovering protectively over Josephine as her body changed to accommodate their growing child. "You're going to worry yourself gray before this baby even arrives," Josephine teased him one evening as he insisted on carrying her across a small puddle in the yard. "Just practicing my fatherly duties," he replied with a grin, setting her gently on her feet. Her expression softened as she placed his hand on her rounded belly, where their child kicked vigorously. "You're already a wonderful father, Jackson Wade." In late September, after a labor that left Jackson pacing anxiously outside their bedroom while Doc Perkins and the midwife attended Josephine, their son was born Daniel Thomas Wade, named for Jackson's father and Josephine's brother. With a shock of dark hair and eyes that would soon settle into the same deep blue as his father's, Daniel was a perfect blend of them both. "He's beautiful," Jackson whispered, holding his son for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Josephine, he's perfect." "Of course he is," she replied tiredly, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy. "He's ours." As autumn turned to winter and their first Christmas as a family approached, Jackson found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. From a dying man with nothing to live for, he had become a husband, a father, a rancher with deep roots in the community and plans for the future. One crisp December evening, with Daniel sleeping peacefully in his cradle and Josephine reading by the fire, Jackson sat at his desk writing in the journal he had begun keeping after their marriage. It was a record of their life together, meant for Daniel and any siblings who might follow a legacy of love and lessons learned. "What are you writing?" Josephine asked, setting aside her book to come stand behind him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. "Just thinking about how far we've come," Jackson replied, covering her hand with his. "About all the tomorrows you've given me." Josephine leaned down to kiss the top of his head, "and the forever you've given me." Outside their window, the first snow of winter began to fall, each flake a promise of renewal and possibility. Jackson Wade, once a man with nothing but a bullet-riddled past, watched the snow with his wife by his side and his sons sleeping nearby, and knew with absolute certainty that he had found his place in the world, his purpose, his redemption, his forever. In the years that followed, the Williams-Wade Ranch prospered, growing in size and reputation. Jackson and Josephine welcomed two more children, a daughter, Elizabeth Hope, in 1878, and another son, James Harold, in 1881. Thomas eventually married a schoolteacher from Fort Worth, building his own home on another section of the ranch land. Captain Daniels Reynolds faded into the past, his power diminished by the very public scrutiny that Jackson's stand against him had ultimately triggered. By 1880, Reynolds had been forced to retire from the Rangers, his reputation tarnished by investigations into his conduct. Jackson never returned to the Rangers, finding his true calling in the land and the family he had built with Josephine. But the principles that had led him to stand against injustice remained core to his character, evident in how he ran his business, raised his children, and participated in the growing community around Fort Worth. And every year, on the anniversary of the day Josephine had found him dying in the Lone Star Saloon, Jackson would take her back to the spot where he had proposed, to watch the sunset and renew the promise they had made to each other, she, to give him reasons for tomorrow, and he, to give her forever. It was a promise they kept until they were old and gray, surrounded by children and grandchildren, their story becoming legend in a Texas that changed around them but never changed what mattered most. That one act of courage, one moment of compassion, one choice to see beyond the darkness of the present to the possibility of tomorrow, could create a forever worth living for.